According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions. The next morning, 19 hijackers changed the world. And that press conference, the one where the Secretary of Defense announced that the United States military had lost track of $2.3 trillion, was forgotten. Not classified, not covered up in the traditional sense. Just forgotten. Because the news cycle moved on. Because September 11th happened. Because $2.5 trillion going missing from the most powerful military in human history was, apparently, a story that could wait. It's still waiting. Let's go back to that press conference. September 10th, 2001. One day before the world changed. Donald Rumsfeld, then Secretary of Defense, stood before cameras and made one of the most extraordinary admissions in the history of American government. He said the Pentagon could not account for approximately $2.3 trillion in financial transactions. Not that the money was stolen. Not that it was spent improperly. Just that the accounting systems were so broken, so archaic, so fundamentally dysfunctional, that no one could say where the money had gone, or if it had gone anywhere, or what it had been spent on. Think about that number for a second. $2.3 trillion. In 2001. That's roughly the entire federal budget for the year. It's more than the GDP of France. It's enough to write every American a check for $8,000. And the Department of Defense had simply lost track of it. Rumsfeld framed this as a bureaucratic problem, an accounting inefficiency, a paperwork issue that needed to be cleaned up. The next day, nobody cared anymore. Before we get to the disappearing accountant, and we will get there, we need to understand how this kind of money goes missing in the first place. Because the answer isn't a heist. It isn't a single villain in a dark room moving money into offshore accounts. The answer is something stranger and, in some ways, more disturbing. It's called unsupported journal vouchers. Here's how the Pentagon budget works, or rather, how it doesn't work. The Department of Defense has hundreds of different financial systems. Dozens of them are legacy computer systems from the 1970s and 1980s, systems that don't talk to each other, don't use compatible formats, and can't be audited by modern software. Some of them still run on programming languages that most computer science graduates have never heard of. When money moves between these systems, and the numbers don't add up, which they routinely don't, accountants are supposed to create a journal voucher, a document explaining the discrepancy, an accounting entry that says, here's why the books don't balance. But when the systems are incompatible enough, when the discrepancies are large enough, when the documentation simply doesn't exist, they create what's called an unsupported journal voucher, which is accounting language for, we made up a number to make the books balance. We have no idea if it's right. The Defense Finance and Accounting Service, DFAS, has been doing this for decades. Adjustments in the hundreds of billions. Sometimes made without any supporting documentation. Sometimes entered multiple times for the same transaction. Sometimes, investigators later found, literally fabricated to meet reporting deadlines. It's not theft in the legal sense. It's accounting chaos dressed up in bureaucratic language. But the result is the same. Trillions of dollars, and no way to verify where they went. Every good story needs someone who notices. Someone who looks at the numbers and says, this doesn't add up. In the Pentagon's case, that person was a woman named Linda Woodford. Linda Woodford worked for the Defense Finance and Accounting Service for 15 years. She was a budget analyst, not a whistleblower by nature, a career civil servant who believed in the system. And every single month, she was handed a stack of journal vouchers to enter into the books. Journal vouchers that had no supporting documentation, no explanation, just numbers, pulled from somewhere, telling her to adjust the accounts by millions of dollars. She was told to enter the numbers, not to question them, not to find supporting documentation, because often there wasn't any. Just enter the numbers and move on. Month after month, year after year, hundreds of billions in adjustments entered into the Pentagon's books with nothing behind them. Reuters journalists Lisa LaVenture and Scott Paltrow spent years investigating this. In 2013, they published a series of reports documenting what they found. The Pentagon's books weren't just messy. They were, in the journalists' words, fictitious. The Defense Department had failed every attempt at an independent audit, not because auditors found fraud, because the records were so disorganized, so incomplete, so fundamentally unreliable, that a proper audit was impossible. Now, the accountant. In the years leading up to Rumsfeld's 2001 announcement, there were specific individuals, not just systems, who signed off on the adjustments, who authorized the unsupported journal vouchers, who made the decision, repeatedly and knowingly, to enter fictional numbers into the official accounts of the United States military. What the record does show is this. Between 1998 and 2000, in the years just before Rumsfeld's press conference, the Pentagon's Inspector General documented adjustments totaling over $2 trillion in unsupported entries for the Army alone. The Army, one branch, 2 years. These weren't rounding errors. These were systematic, repeated, institutionalized falsifications of the federal accounts. And the people who signed off on them, most of them retired. Some were promoted. A handful faced internal reviews that went nowhere. Nobody went to prison. Nobody was fired. The system simply absorbed what had happened and kept going. For decades, the Pentagon was the only major federal agency never to have completed an independent audit. Every other department, Treasury, State, Health and Human Services, submits to annual audits. The Pentagon simply didn't. This isn't controversial. The Pentagon openly acknowledged it couldn't pass an audit. They called it a long-term goal, something they were working toward for 20 years. In 2018, under pressure from Congress, the Department of Defense finally, for the first time in history, submitted to a full independent audit. 2,400 auditors, hundreds of locations worldwide, the largest audit of a government entity ever attempted. The result? They failed. Section 5, VO 21. Not narrowly, not close, but some paperwork issues. They failed comprehensively. Auditors couldn't verify the existence of significant portions of the Pentagon's assets. Equipment listed in the books couldn't be physically located. Financial transactions couldn't be traced. Accounting systems remained incompatible with modern auditing standards. The Pentagon's comptroller at the time said, and I want to quote him directly, "We failed the audit, but we never expected to pass it. We failed the audit, but we never expected to pass it." The largest military in human history, with a budget larger than the next 10 countries combined, submitted to its first ever audit knowing it would fail, and was apparently fine with that outcome. They have attempted the audit every year since. They have failed every year since. Let's return to something that deserves more attention than it gets. The timing of Rumsfeld's announcement. September 10, 2001. One day before the most significant terrorist attack on American soil in history. Was that timing coincidental? Almost certainly yes. There's no credible evidence that the announcement was timed to be buried. Rumsfeld had been Secretary of Defense for less than a year. He was in the early stages of a push to modernize and reform the Pentagon's bureaucracy. The announcement was part of a legitimate internal reform initiative. But the effect of the timing was real, regardless of intent. The story disappeared from public consciousness within 24 hours. Completely. Totally. Not because of a cover-up. Because the news cycle simply had no room for accounting irregularities when the country was processing an act of war. And here's the uncomfortable truth. By the time the dust settled from September 11th, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from the entire post-9/11 decade, nobody went back. The journalists moved on. The congressional oversight committees had other priorities. The public, understandably, was focused elsewhere. $2.3 trillion. Lost. Not stolen, not hidden, just lost, by the most powerful institution in human history. And the story got one news cycle. Now here's what I want to be precise about, because this story is often told in a way that's misleading. The $2.3 trillion, and the larger figures that have emerged in subsequent investigations, almost certainly didn't vanish into someone's pocket. The more accurate and, in some ways, more disturbing truth is this. Nobody knows. Some of it was almost certainly spent on real things. Military equipment, base construction, salaries, procurement contracts. The money moved through the system, did something, and the accounting records of what it did are simply gone or were never created properly. Some of it was almost certainly double-counted, entered multiple times. Phantom transactions that existed on paper but not in reality, created to balance books that couldn't otherwise be balanced. In some portion, investigators suspect, but cannot prove, because the records don't exist, flowed to defense contractors in transactions that were never properly documented, never properly audited, and never properly reconciled. The defense contracting industry in America is a $400 billion per year business. It operates with a level of financial transparency that would be illegal in any publicly traded company. Cost overruns are routine. No-bid contracts are common. And the accountability mechanisms that are supposed to catch fraud and waste are dependent on the very accounting systems that have been proven, repeatedly, to be fundamentally broken. It's not a conspiracy theory to point this out. The Pentagon's own Inspector General has documented billions in improper payments, unsupported transactions, and unverifiable expenditures every single year for decades. The scale isn't a secret. It's just not a story anyone seems particularly motivated to keep telling. So who benefits from a system that can't be audited? The answer, unfortunately, is a lot of people with a lot of power. Defense contractors benefit because unaudited spending is spending that can't be scrutinized for waste or fraud. The government pays $640 for a bolt, $7,600 for a coffee maker. These aren't urban legends. They're documented procurement records, and an unauditable system makes it very hard to challenge those prices. Members of Congress who sit on defense committees benefit because defense spending flows to their districts in the form of jobs, contracts, and economic activity. The political incentive to fix the accounting is far weaker than the political incentive to keep the money flowing. And perhaps most importantly, the Pentagon itself benefits in a counterintuitive way. An institution that cannot be audited cannot be held accountable for how it spends money. And an institution that can't be held accountable for spending money is an institution that is very, very difficult to cut. The Pentagon's budget has grown in almost every single year for the past 4 decades. Through Republican administrations and Democratic ones. Through peace and war. Through economic booms and recessions. A broken accounting system isn't just a failure. In some ways, it's a feature. Let me be honest about what this story is and isn't. It isn't proof that a single accountant or a small group of people deliberately stole trillions of dollars from the American public. The headline is provocative, and the reality, as usual, is more complicated and in some ways more disturbing. The reality is that the United States government has built a financial system for its military that is, by the government's own repeated admission, unauditable, and has been for at least 30 years, and will remain so for the foreseeable future. The reality is that $2.3 trillion, and subsequently much larger figures, cannot be accounted for. Not because the money was stolen by one person, but because the systems designed to track it were allowed to remain broken by people who had every incentive to let them stay that way. Rumsfeld stood up on September 10, 2001, and said something that should have triggered a national reckoning, and it was buried under history the very next morning. And the people who were supposed to keep asking about it stopped asking. The money didn't disappear because of one accountant. It disappeared because of a system built over decades, maintained by inertia and self-interest, protected by complexity, that made disappearing easy. And the accountants who enabled it? They retired with their pensions. The audit is still failing, and the budget keeps growing. If that bothers you, and it should, share this video. Not because sharing a video fixes anything, but because the first step to demanding accountability is knowing what you're supposed to be holding people accountable for. Sources and further reading are linked in the description. I'd especially recommend the Reuters investigation by Scott Paltrow. It's some of the most important financial journalism of the last 20 years that almost nobody has read. I'll see you in the next one.